February 1847, Charleston, South Carolina. A government clerk opens a ledger and freezes. What he's reading is impossible. 47 enslaved people, 3 generations, none of whom had ever left a plantation. All speaking perfect French, not broken Creole, pure, flawless French from northern France. There were no French books on the property. No French visitors. The plantation owner didn't speak a word of French. When authorities asked the eldest woman where they learned it, she said one word, the cellar. But there was no cellar. Just red clay and bedrock. Within 1 week, the official record was erased. The families were scattered across 3 states. The case was buried, but someone kept notes. And what those notes reveal will make you question everything you think you know about American history. Part 1: The Discovery. Before we dive into one of the most disturbing historical mysteries ever hidden from the American public, I need you to do something. Hit that subscribe button right now. Because stories like this, real documented cases that were deliberately erased from history, are exactly what this channel is about. And drop a comment telling me what state you're watching from. I want to know how far this story reaches. Now let's uncover the truth about what happened along the Cooper River. The official discovery happened in February of 1847, but the real story begins 30 years earlier. And I need to warn you, what you're about to hear is documented. This isn't folklore. This isn't legend. This comes from sealed records in a hidden journal that shouldn't exist. Thomas Grayson bought his plantation in 1809. 600 acres of prime land along the Cooper River, about 15 miles north of Charleston. He wasn't rich. He wasn't famous. Just a regular third-generation South Carolinian trying to make a living growing rice. His grandfather came from England back in the 1730s, and the Graysons had been unremarkable but steady planters ever since. Middle class by plantation standards. Comfortable but not wealthy, Thomas was a widower. Methodical. Organized. He kept detailed account books and ran everything by strict routine. His neighbors said he wasn't particularly cruel, which for that time and place was almost a compliment. He was just a man trying to run a business. When Thomas bought the property, it came with 42 enslaved individuals. Families who had worked that land for decades under the previous owner, a Dutch man named Cornelius Vandermeer. Vandermeer had died without any heirs, so the property went up for sale. Thomas knew almost nothing about the man except that he'd been a recluse. Rarely came to Charleston, hardly had any visitors, ran the whole operation with minimal staff and kept to himself. The location was isolated even by 1809 standards. You could only reach it by river or by a wagon road that turned into a swamp whenever it rained hard. It was remote, cut off, exactly the kind of place where something strange could happen without anyone noticing. The enslaved community had several family lines. The Baptists, the Leroux family, the Duchamps, some others whose names got changed in the record books until you couldn't recognize them anymore. They worked the rice fields, maintained the plantation house, lived in small cabins on the northern edge of the property. Simple wooden structures, 1 family per cabin. Among them was a woman named Marguerite. The plantation records called her Maggie. She worked in the main house and was already elderly when Thomas took over. She'll become important later. Remember her name. Thomas Grayson noticed something strange within his first month of ownership. He was out supervising the rice fields one afternoon when he heard 2 workers talking. The language they were using wasn't English. It wasn't Gullah Creole either, that musical blend of English and West African languages that was common among enslaved populations in the South Carolina Low Country. This was something completely different. It flowed. It had rhythm. It sounded European. When Thomas got closer, the workers immediately switched to English. Their faces went neutral. Careful. He figured it was just some dialect he didn't know and dismissed it. But it kept happening. He'd hear women speaking that language while hanging laundry. An old man would mutter something over the cooking fire. Children would whisper to each other, then go silent the second they saw him approaching. Always the same unfamiliar language. Always immediately cut off when they knew he was listening. Thomas wasn't naturally curious, but he was methodical. The pattern bothered him, so he asked his neighbors about it at a dinner party in Charleston. They shrugged it off. Field workers always had their own languages, they said. Fragments from Africa, mixed together and changed over time. Why did it matter what they spoke among themselves? It mattered to Thomas because of what happened in late autumn of 1809. Just 9 months after he'd bought the property, a 6-year-old enslaved child got injured. The plantation records called him Peter, but his real name was Pierre. A rice winnowing basket shattered and sent wooden splinters deep into his arm. The wound got infected. Within days, the boy was burning up with fever, delirious, barely conscious. Thomas prided himself on maintaining his property, which included his workforce, so he sent for a doctor from Charleston. While waiting for the physician to arrive, Thomas went to the boy's cabin to check on him. The child was mumbling continuously, lost in fever dreams. His mother knelt beside him, whispering urgently. And Thomas Grayson, standing in that doorway, heard something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The boy was speaking perfect French. Not broken fragments. Not jumbled words. Clear, complex, grammatically sophisticated French. The kind of French you'd hear in university lecture halls or aristocratic drawing rooms in Paris. The mother saw Thomas and went completely silent. Her eyes filled with something that looked like pure terror. The doctor came, bled the boy according to standard medical practice, applied a poultice. The fever broke. The child survived. But Thomas couldn't forget what he'd heard. He knew what French sounded like even though he couldn't speak it himself. Charleston had plenty of Huguenots, descendants of French Protestants who'd fled religious persecution back in Europe. French was the language of diplomacy, education, high culture. It absolutely was not something a 6-year-old enslaved child on an isolated South Carolina plantation should know, much less speak fluently while delirious with fever. So Thomas started paying real attention. Over the next several months, he confirmed what seemed impossible. His entire enslaved population spoke French among themselves. Not as a second language. As their primary language. They used English when they had to, when talking to him or handling plantation business. But among themselves, French flowed as naturally as breathing. Mothers sang lullabies to their babies in French. Old men told stories in French. Arguments broke out in rapid, colloquial French that sounded exactly like it came from people who'd spent their whole lives in France. The impossibility of this consumed Thomas Grayson. These families had been on this property for decades. Some were born right here. The genealogical records that Vandermeer had kept were incredibly detailed and meticulous. Thomas had studied them carefully during the property transfer. And that's where the mystery deepens into something far stranger. If you're as disturbed by this as I am, share this video. People need to know these stories exist. Next time, we'll explore what Thomas found in Vandermeer's records, and trust me, it only gets more impossible from here. Subscribe so you don't miss part 2. Drop a comment with your theories. And remember, this actually happened. The evidence exists. They just don't want you to know about it. The Cellar That Never Existed. Part 2: The Forbidden School. Hook 000 to 045. A French shipwreck. A desperate couple. And a deal with the devil disguised as enlightenment. In 1782, a reclusive Dutch plantation owner made an offer to 2 stranded French teachers that would change everything. He asked them to do something that was illegal, dangerous, and would create the impossible mystery we uncovered in Part 1. He asked them to educate enslaved people as if they were French aristocrats. To teach them literature, philosophy, manners, culture. To prove that human potential had nothing to do with race and everything to do with opportunity. It worked. It worked so well that 30 years later, authorities would panic and erase all evidence that it ever happened. But they didn't erase everything. And what survived reveals a truth that some people desperately wanted buried. Part 2: The Experiment. If you haven't watched Part 1, stop right now and go watch it. This story only makes sense if you understand what Thomas Grayson discovered in 1809. 42 enslaved people speaking perfect French on an isolated plantation where French should have been impossible. Now we're going back further. To the man who owned the property before Grayson. To Cornelius Vandermeer. And to the secret experiment that explains everything. But first, smash that subscribe button. Part 3 drops next week and you do not want to miss where this goes. Comment below and tell me, have you ever heard anything like this in American history class? Because I'm betting you haven't. They made sure of that. Cornelius Vandermeer, the mysterious Dutch plantation owner, wasn't just a recluse. He was a philosopher, an intellectual, a man obsessed with questions about human nature and potential. He'd been heavily influenced by French Enlightenment thinkers, especially Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau wrote about natural human potential and how civilization corrupts it. About how people aren't born inferior, they're made inferior by circumstance and opportunity. Vandermeer became consumed by one specific theory. He believed that language and culture could be transmitted perfectly from one person to another, like lighting one candle from another candle, if the conditions were exactly right. If the environment was controlled precisely enough. It was just a theory. An intellectual exercise. Until 1782, when something happened that gave Vandermeer a chance to test it in real life. A French ship ran into trouble off the Carolina coast. The Marie Claire, sailing out of St. Malo in Brittany. It was fleeing from British naval ships during the Revolutionary War period. The ship was packed with refugees from a failed colonial venture in what would become Haiti. Wealthy French planters and their families running from slave uprisings and yellow fever outbreaks. The Marie Claire hit a massive storm and broke apart on a sandbar near the mouth of the Cooper River. Most of the people on board drowned. But a few survivors made it to shore, battered and traumatized. Among those survivors were two people who would change everything. Philippe Laurent, a schoolteacher from Dinant in Brittany, and his wife, Cécile, who had taught at a girls' school in St. Malo. They were educated middle-class French citizens. Not wealthy, but cultured, intelligent. Trained as professional educators. They'd been traveling to Martinique to take new teaching positions when the ship went down. They lost everything in the shipwreck. Their documents, their belongings, any proof of who they were. They were now destitute, stranded in a foreign country, and in serious legal danger as French citizens in a region still caught up in Revolutionary War conflicts. Cornelius Vandermeer found them on his property, exhausted and desperate, barely alive. And he made them an offer. An offer that seemed like salvation but was actually something much darker. He would shelter them, provide them with food, clothing, resources. Eventually arrange for their passage back to Europe. They'd be safe, protected, cared for. In exchange, they would undertake an educational experiment that Vandermeer would design and oversee. Philippe and Cécile, given their circumstances, really had no choice. They agreed, and then Vandermeer explained what the experiment actually was. At that time, Vandermeer's enslaved population consisted of several family groups. Approximately 35 people total, including children. His proposal was radical and, in that time and place, completely illegal. The Laurents would teach these people French language and French culture. Not basic skills, not simple tasks. They would teach them as if they were educating the children of the French bourgeoisie. The middle and upper class. Reading and writing, literature, history, mathematics, music, geography of France, social manners and graces, even Latin. A complete, rigorous, sophisticated education. The same education that wealthy French children received in elite schools. Vandermeer wanted to prove something. He wanted to see if enslaved individuals, given the same rigorous education as any European, could achieve the same intellectual sophistication. The same cultural knowledge. The same capabilities. It was an experiment in human potential. A test of whether race had anything to do with intelligence or if everything came down to opportunity and environment. But it was also, though Vandermeer probably never admitted this to himself, an act of profound cruelty disguised as enlightenment. Because what happens when you educate people to understand exactly how trapped they are? When you give them knowledge of a world they can never access. When you make them fluent in freedom while keeping them in chains. Philippe and Cécile Laurent, trapped and completely dependent on Vandermeer's goodwill for their survival, agreed to his terms. In late 1782, they began teaching. Vandermeer constructed a building specifically for this purpose on the northern section of the property. He called it the schoolhouse, though in later official records it would only be listed as storage. Hiding in plain sight, classes were held 6 days a week. Adults and children both attended. Everyone participated. The Laurents taught reading and writing in French, mathematics, French history and the geography of France, literature and poetry, French songs, the manners and social graces of French society, proper forms of address, cultural customs, everything. They created, in effect, a complete French village school transplanted into the South Carolina Low Country. Hidden on an isolated plantation that almost no outsiders ever visited. And here's the thing, the Laurents were genuinely skilled teachers. They were professionals. They knew what they were doing. And they were teaching students who had incredibly strong motivation to learn. The enslaved population understood something that maybe Vandermeer didn't fully grasp. Education was a form of resistance. A preservation of self and dignity. A way to maintain humanity in a system designed to destroy it. They learned with ferocious intensity. Children who had never held a book in their lives became fluent readers within months. Adults who had known only fieldwork began discussing philosophy and literature. They debated ideas. They wrote essays. They learned history and geography and mathematics. Within 3 years, by 1785, Vandermeer's enslaved population spoke French as their primary language. They possessed cultural knowledge that would have qualified them for educated society in France itself. They could have walked into a Parisian salon and held their own in any intellectual conversation. The experiment had succeeded beyond Vandermeer's expectations. But in 1785, everything went wrong. Philippe Laurent fell ill with malaria. In that time, in that climate, malaria was often a death sentence. He went from healthy to dead in less than a week. Cécile was devastated. She'd already lost everything in the shipwreck. Now she'd lost her husband. She was truly alone, trapped on a remote plantation, complicit in an illegal experiment, with no way home. She continued teaching for several more months, but her grief made her increasingly unstable. She started having moral clarity about their situation, about what they'd actually been doing. She began speaking openly about the immorality of it all, about how they'd participated in something that propped up and validated an evil system. How they'd been tools of oppression dressed up as enlightenment. She threatened to leave, to go to Charleston and tell the authorities exactly what Vandermeer had done. Vandermeer couldn't allow that to happen. What he'd done was legally ambiguous at best. Teaching enslaved people to read and write was actually illegal in South Carolina, though the law wasn't always enforced consistently. But beyond the legal concerns, Vandermeer feared his experiment becoming public knowledge. It would raise too many uncomfortable questions. Questions about human nature, about the justifications for slavery, about capability and circumstance, about what people were actually capable of when given opportunity. Those questions were dangerous. One morning in December 1785, Cécile Laurent's body was found at the base of the bluff overlooking the river. Official cause of death: accidental fall. Vandermeer arranged for a quick burial in an unmarked grave somewhere on the property. And the experiment continued in secret for another 24 years. This is just the beginning. Next week in part 3, we'll discover what Thomas Grayson found when he started digging into Vandermeer's records. And trust me, it gets so much darker. Hit subscribe so you don't miss it. Share this video because this story needs to be told. And comment with your thoughts. Did Cécile really fall? Or was she silenced? I'll see you in part 3. The cellar that never existed. Part 3: The secret lives on. Hook 000 to 045. December 1785. A woman's body lies at the base of a cliff. Official cause of death: accident. But Cécile Laurent knew too much. And dead women tell no tales. For the next 24 years, an impossible secret would survive in the minds of enslaved people on an isolated plantation. They would pass perfect French from generation to generation with religious devotion. And when Thomas Grayson finally died in 1847, he made one fatal mistake. He wrote a letter that would bring everything crashing down. Within weeks, a government clerk named Samuel Winters would walk through those slave quarters and hear something that would make him freeze in his tracks. Perfect French, flowing like poetry, coming from people who should have been impossible to educate. And what Samuel discovered in those conversations would force authorities to make a choice. Preserve the truth or bury it forever. Part 3: The Preservation. Welcome back to the most disturbing historical cover-up you've never heard about. If you're just joining us, stop right now. Go back and watch parts 1 and 2. This story builds and you need the full context to understand what's coming. And if you're already subscribed, thank you. If not, what are you waiting for? Hit that button because part 4 is going to blow your mind. So Cécile Laurent is dead. Found at the bottom of a cliff in December 1785. Vandermeer calls it an accident. Gets her buried quickly in an unmarked grave. No investigation. No questions. Just gone. And then Vandermeer does something that reveals just how deep his obsession really goes. He destroys everything. Every single trace of the experiment except the knowledge itself. He burns all of Cécile's personal papers. All the educational materials that she and Philippe had created over 3 years of teaching. Lesson plans, student work, everything. He destroys every physical piece of evidence that the experiment ever happened. Everything except what was now living in the minds of 35 enslaved people. And here's where it gets really twisted. Instead of trying to make them stop speaking French, instead of suppressing what they'd learned, Vandermeer encouraged it. He wanted them to keep speaking French. Keep teaching their children. Keep preserving everything the Laurents had taught them. Because Vandermeer wanted to see if his theory was actually true. He wanted to know if knowledge could transmit perfectly from one generation to the next without any outside help. Like lighting candles from other candles. Could cultural transmission occur flawlessly in complete isolation? He started documenting everything in private journals. Recording vocabulary retention, noting grammatical accuracy, observing how cultural practices were being preserved. He treated his enslaved population like specimens in an ongoing scientific experiment. All while maintaining the outward appearance of just being a regular plantation owner. The population cooperated, but not because they cared about Vandermeer's sick experiment. They cooperated because the French language had become theirs. It was their secret. Their community bond, their act of cultural preservation and resistance. They taught their children French, not as Vandermeer's experimental subjects, but as their own choice. They maintained the knowledge the Laurents had given them because it was valuable. Because it was beautiful. Because it was something that couldn't be taken from them as long as they held it in their minds and passed it to their children. This continued for 24 years. 3 entire generations learned perfect French in total isolation on a South Carolina plantation. Think about that. No books. No outside teachers. Just oral transmission. Parent to child. Elder to young. Perfect preservation. And then in 1809, Cornelius Vandermeer had a stroke. He died 3 days later, taking his secrets with him. But before he died, while he was still lucid enough to understand what was coming, he burned his journals. He burned the Laurents' belongings that he'd been storing all those years. He destroyed every single physical trace of what had happened. All that remained was the knowledge itself. Alive in the people he'd treated as his grand experiment. Thomas Grayson, the new owner, would never learn most of this history. He eventually figured out that there had been an experiment. He found brief mentions in old property records about French educators employed in the 1780s. But he never understood the full scope of what Vandermeer had actually done. What Thomas did understand was that he now owned people who possessed dangerous knowledge. Literacy was already problematic enough. But French language, and French culture, that suggested connections to revolutionary ideals. To Haiti and the successful slave revolution there. to concepts like liberty, equality, fraternity. Explosive ideas that could get everyone killed. For nearly 3 decades, Thomas maintained an uneasy balance. He allowed the French to continue privately, never openly acknowledged it, never spoke about it, and in exchange, his workforce remained orderly and productive. The families kept their secret. Children born on the plantation grew up speaking French as their first language, English as their second. They preserved stories and songs, maintained oral traditions, kept alive the memory of Philippe and Cécile Laurent as almost mythical figures, benefactors who had given them an incredible gift. Among all the families, the Baptistes emerged as the primary keepers of the tradition. The matriarch, the woman Thomas knew as Maggie but who was called Marguerite within the community, had been a young woman when the Laurents first arrived in 1782. She had learned to read directly from Cécile Laurent herself. She had memorized entire books. And in her cabin, hidden beneath the floorboards, she kept a small collection of sacred objects. A single book in French, a religious text the Laurents had used for teaching, and several papers with handwritten notes in Cécile's own handwriting. These were treasured, protected, almost worshipped. Marguerite taught her daughter Émilie. Émilie taught her own children. The transmission was faithful. The French spoken on Grayson's plantation was pristine, grammatically sophisticated, culturally rich. It hadn't degraded or turned into Creole over the decades. If anything, it had been preserved with almost religious devotion. But secrets create pressure, and pressure eventually finds cracks. In 1823, something happened that nearly exposed everything. A young man named Jacques, listed as Jack in the plantation records, fell in love with a woman named Marie. She'd been purchased from a neighboring plantation. Marie spoke Gullah Creole and English, no French. Jacques taught her French while courting her. And Marie was a quick student. Within a year, she was conversational, if not fully fluent. In 1824, Marie's former owner, a planter named Daniels, came to visit Grayson's property to discuss business about sharing a rice mill. While he was there, he ran into Marie, tried to speak with her, and she responded in French. Not intentionally, just automatically, because she'd been speaking French with Jacques moments before. Daniels was absolutely stunned. He questioned Thomas Grayson sharply. Why was one of his former slaves now speaking French? What kind of peculiar practices was Grayson running? Was he educating his workforce? Because that was illegal, Thomas had to think fast. He made up a story on the spot. Claimed Marie had picked up fragments of French from a Charleston Huguenot woman who had briefly visited to give religious instruction. Complete fiction. Daniels seemed skeptical but let it drop. But the incident terrified Thomas. He realized how fragile this secret actually was. How easily it could become public. How dangerous that would be. He created a strict new rule. French was only to be spoken in the quarters. Never where any visitors might possibly overhear. The community agreed, but the close call had shaken everyone. Years passed. Thomas grew older. The rice plantation stayed profitable but required constant work. The political situation was getting more tense. Nullification crisis. Growing abolitionist sentiment up north. Increasing tension over slavery's future. The enslaved population on Grayson's plantation continued their dual existence. Field workers speaking English, French speakers in private. Children were born. The elderly died. Life cycled through generations with the French language as the constant thread connecting them to something larger than their circumstances. Thomas never remarried, never had children. His nephew William would visit occasionally from Charleston, but Thomas kept him away from day-to-day plantation operations. Thomas was afraid William might discover the French and react badly. Thomas had actually grown protective of the secret, even though it wasn't really his. He understood that the knowledge his workforce possessed was remarkable, unprecedented, and potentially dangerous to everyone involved. In 1846, Thomas Grayson started having what looked like small strokes. His health went downhill fast. By December, he was bedridden. He knew he was dying. And in January 1847, in a moment of clarity, Thomas made a decision that would destroy the very secret he'd protected for decades. He wrote a letter to the Charleston Linguistic Society. In it, he described the French-speaking enslaved population on his plantation. He requested that scholars come document this phenomenon before it was lost forever. He claimed he wanted the knowledge preserved for scientific purposes. Maybe he wanted validation for the decades he'd spent keeping this strange secret. Maybe he felt guilty and wanted someone to know the truth. Maybe he just wanted to matter. To be remembered for something unusual. The letter was delivered 3 days after Thomas Grayson died in his sleep. His nephew William inherited the property and immediately started selling everything off. The plantation was buried in debt. William needed cash fast. The timing was catastrophic. The state magistrate's office got involved because of the debts. When they came to catalog the property for auction, a junior clerk named Samuel Winters came along to do the assessment. Samuel was methodical, educated, observant. And crucially, he was fluent in French. He'd studied it at the College of Charleston. On a cold February morning in 1847, Samuel walked through the slave quarters with his ledger, recording names and estimated values for the estate sale. And then he heard it. French. Not fragments. Not broken pidgin. Perfect, flowing, beautiful French. A woman scolding 2 children for tracking mud into a cabin. An elderly man telling a story to a small group, gesturing expressively. Samuel stopped walking, stood completely still, and listened. The French was impeccable. Grammar, vocabulary, accent, everything. He heard regional pronunciations from northern France. He heard idiomatic expressions he'd only studied in advanced university courses. Samuel approached the elderly man and spoke to him in French. "Excuse me, sir, where did you learn French?" The man stared at him, startled. Then, maybe sensing genuine curiosity instead of threat in Samuel's voice, he answered. "Teachers who came when I was a child. They taught us as if we were their own children. My sister remembers better than I do." Samuel spent the next 2 hours talking with Marguerite, who was now about 70 years old. What she told him would change everything. Next week in part 4, we'll explore exactly what Marguerite revealed and why authorities decided this secret was too dangerous to ever become public. Subscribe right now so you don't miss it. Share this video. Comment below with your theories about what happens next. And remember, this actually happened. The evidence exists. They just tried to make sure you'd never find it. The cellar that never existed. Part 4 The Confession. Hook 000 to 045. February 1847. A 70-year-old woman sits across from a government clerk and begins to speak. For the first time in her life, she tells the truth to an outsider. She describes teachers who came from the sea. A woman who taught with love and died mysteriously. A Dutch master who turned human beings into an experiment. And she pulls out a hidden book, papers in faded handwriting, proof that something impossible had actually happened. Samuel Winters sits there, his hands shaking as he writes everything down, realizing he's documenting something that will shatter every assumption about education, race, and human potential. Within days, powerful people will read his report. And they will make a decision that will echo through history. Some truths are too dangerous to be allowed to exist. This is what happened when one of those truths tried to come into the light. Part 4 The Testimony. If you haven't been following this series from the beginning, you need to go back right now. Start with Part 1. This is not a story you can jump into halfway through. And if you're already hooked on this investigation, hit that subscribe button because next week's episode reveals how the cover-up actually happened. It's going to make you question everything you think you know about American history. So it's February 1847. Samuel Winters, a junior clerk for the Charleston magistrate's office, is standing in the slave quarters of Thomas Grayson's plantation. And he's just heard something impossible. Perfect French. Sophisticated, grammatically flawless French being spoken by people who should never have had access to that kind of education. Samuel is fluent in French himself. He studied it at the College of Charleston. So he knows exactly what he's hearing. This isn't some pidgin language or broken Creole. This is the real thing. He approaches an elderly man who's been telling a story to a small group. Samuel speaks to him in French, asking where he learned the language. The man, startled but sensing something genuine in Samuel's curiosity, answers. Teachers who came when I was a child. They taught us as if we were their own children. My sister remembers better than I do. The sister he's talking about is Marguerite. The woman Thomas Grayson had called Maggie. The matriarch of the Baptiste family. The keeper of the tradition. At this point, she's approximately 70 years old. She's been alive since before the Lawrence arrived. She was there for everything. Samuel asks to speak with her. The man nods and leads him to Marguerite's cabin. What happens next, Samuel records in meticulous detail in his personal diary. That diary would eventually end up in the Charleston Historical Society archives in 1891 when his grandson donated it. It sat there unnoticed for decades until a researcher stumbled across it in the 1960s. By then, everyone involved was long dead. But the words remained. Marguerite invites Samuel into her cabin. It's small, simple, like all the others. Wooden walls, dirt floor, a few basic furnishings. But it's clean, organized, cared for. Samuel sits down and explains that he's documenting the estate for sale. That he heard French being spoken. That he's curious about how this community learned the language. Marguerite studies him for a long moment. Samuel writes in his diary that her eyes were sharp, intelligent, assessing. She's trying to decide if he can be trusted. If this moment, after decades of secrecy, is finally the time to tell someone outside the community what really happened. And then she begins to speak. In French. Beautiful, flowing French. She tells Samuel about the teachers. A man and a woman who came from the sea. From a shipwreck. She was young when they arrived, maybe 16 or 17 years old. The year was 1782. The teachers were French, educated, cultured. The man's name was Philippe. The woman was Cécile. They were kind, Marguerite says. They treated their students with respect and affection. They didn't teach like masters. Teaching slaves. They taught like teachers teaching students they cared about. Marguerite describes the classes. 6 days a week in a building the old master Vandermeer had constructed. They learned reading and writing first. Then mathematics, French history, geography of France, literature and poetry, songs, even Latin, proper manners and social graces. She says the whole community attended. Adults and children together. Everyone learning. Everyone passionate about education because they understood. Even if the teachers and Vandermeer didn't fully grasp this, that knowledge was resistance. That education was a way to preserve their humanity in a system designed to strip it away. For 3 years, Marguerite says, the teachers worked with them. The community became fluent, literate, educated to a level that would have qualified them for society in France itself. Then Philippe died. Malaria. It happened fast. Within a week he was gone. Cécile continued teaching for a while, but she was devastated. Grieving. Alone. And she started talking about the immorality of what they were doing. About how they'd become tools in a system they should have opposed. Marguerite's voice gets quiet here. Samuel notes this in his diary. She says Cécile threatened to leave. To go to Charleston and tell the authorities what Vandermeer had done. That teaching enslaved people was illegal and Vandermeer needed to be stopped. Then one morning, Cécile was found dead at the base of the bluff overlooking the river. They said she fell. An accident. Marguerite doesn't say outright that Vandermeer killed her. But the implication hangs in the air between them. Samuel writes that Marguerite's expression made it clear what she believed had happened. Cécile was buried somewhere on the property. Marguerite doesn't know where exactly. Vandermeer did it quickly, quietly, with no marker. After Cécile's death, Marguerite continues, Vandermeer destroyed everything. All the papers, all the educational materials, all the books except one. Everything that could prove the teachers had existed. But he told the community to keep speaking French. To keep teaching their children. He wanted to see if they could preserve the knowledge without any outside help. If the transmission could remain perfect across generations. And they did. Not because Vandermeer wanted them to, but because the French language had become theirs. Their identity, their bond, their secret. Marguerite taught her daughter Emily everything she'd learned from Cecile. Emily taught her children. Other families did the same. They preserved it with devotion, like a sacred trust. Then Marguerite does something that Samuel wasn't expecting. She gets up and walks to the corner of the cabin. She kneels down and pries up one of the floorboards. From the hidden space beneath, she pulls out a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. She unwraps it carefully, reverently. Inside is a book, old, worn, but well cared for. A French religious text that the Laurents had used for teaching. And several papers, handwritten notes in faded ink. Lesson plans, exercises, all in Cecile Laurents' handwriting. These are the only physical pieces of evidence that survived. Marguerite has been hiding them, protecting them, for over 60 years. Samuel is astonished. He asks if he can examine them. Marguerite hesitates, then nods. Samuel carefully looks through the papers. The handwriting is elegant, educated. The lesson plans are sophisticated, well structured. This was clearly created by a trained, professional educator. The book is a French Bible with extensive notes in the margins. Teaching notes, vocabulary explanations, grammar exercises. Samuel asks Marguerite if he can document this. Write down what she's told him. She agrees, but makes him promise something. She wants the truth to be known. She wants people to understand what happened here. What they achieved. What they preserved. Samuel spends 2 hours taking notes. Recording Marguerite's testimony. Documenting the contents of the hidden materials. Writing down names, dates, everything she can remember. When he's finished, he thanks her. In his diary, he writes that he was moved nearly to tears. That what he'd witnessed was one of the most remarkable examples of human resilience and intellectual achievement he'd ever encountered. He asks to speak with others in the community. Over the next several hours, he interviews more people. Young and old, all of them speak perfect French. All of them can read and write. All of them possess knowledge of French culture, history, literature that would astound any educated person in Charleston. Samuel documents all of it. He records conversations, notes vocabulary, observes cultural practices that have been perfectly preserved across 3 generations in complete isolation. By the end of the day, Samuel Winters understands that he's stumbled onto something historically significant. Something that challenges fundamental assumptions about education, intelligence, and human potential. He also understands that what he's discovered is incredibly dangerous. Teaching enslaved people to read and write is illegal in South Carolina. What happened on this plantation is evidence of a massive, long-term violation of that law. The people involved are all either dead or about to be sold to different owners across multiple states. And the implications of this discovery are explosive. If enslaved people can achieve this level of education, this level of cultural sophistication, what does that say about the entire justification for slavery? About claims of inherent inferiority. About everything the system is built on. Samuel writes in his diary that he felt the weight of what he'd learned. The responsibility, the danger. He finishes his assessment, completes the estate inventory, and returns to Charleston with his documentation. What happens next will determine whether this remarkable story becomes part of history or gets buried forever. And that's where we'll pick up next week in part 5. The cover-up begins. Powerful people make decisions. And 47 human beings get scattered across 3 states to ensure this secret dies with them. Subscribe now so you don't miss it. Share this with everyone you know because this story deserves to be told. And comment below. Do you think Samuel should have kept this secret or exposed it? I'll see you next week. The Cellar That Never Existed. Part 5 The Erasure. Hook 000 to 045. Samuel Winters walked into his office in Charleston carrying documentation that could change American history. Testimony from 70-year-old Marguerite. Notes in a dead teacher's handwriting. Proof that enslaved people could achieve the same intellectual heights as any European if given the chance. He wrote his report. Detailed, factual, undeniable. And he handed it to his supervisor. Within 72 hours, that report would reach the desk of the magistrate. Then the governor's office. Then rooms where powerful men made decisions about what truths were safe and what truths were dangerous. They read about 47 French-speaking enslaved people who challenged every justification for the system that made them wealthy. And they made a choice. Some evidence is too threatening to exist. Some stories are too dangerous to tell. This is how they erased it. Part 5: The Decision. Welcome back. If you're new here, stop. Go watch parts 1 through 4 right now. This story only works if you understand everything that led to this moment. And if you've been with us from the beginning, thank you. Make sure you're subscribed because part 6 is going to show you exactly how they scattered 47 people across 3 states to kill this secret forever. Now let's talk about what happens when truth becomes inconvenient for powerful people. Samuel Winters returns to Charleston with his documentation. It's late February 1847. He's spent an entire day at the Grayson plantation. Interviewed Marguerite and multiple other members of the enslaved community. Documented their perfect French. Recorded their testimonies about the Lawrence and Vandermeer's experiment. Examined the hidden book and papers that Marguerite had preserved for over 60 years. He knows what he's carrying is significant. Historically important. Maybe even revolutionary in its implications. But he also knows it's dangerous. Samuel is a junior clerk. 26 years old. Educated but not wealthy. Not powerful. Not connected to Charleston's elite families. He's a bureaucrat doing a job, cataloging an estate for auction to pay off debts. But he's also someone who believes in truth. In documentation. In preserving history. His diary makes this clear. He writes that he felt obligated to record what he'd discovered accurately and completely. That this was too important to ignore or minimize. So he writes his report. A thorough, detailed account of what he found at the Grayson plantation. He describes the French-speaking population. Quotes from his conversations with Marguerite. Explains the history of the Lawrence as Marguerite told it to him. Notes the existence of the hidden educational materials. He includes everything. The shipwreck in 1782. The 3 years of intensive education. Cecile Lawrence's suspicious death. Vandermeer's continuation of the experiment. The perfect preservation of French language and culture across 3 generations in complete isolation. He writes it factually, without embellishment, but the implications are clear. This is proof that enslaved people, given proper education, can achieve the same intellectual sophistication as anyone else. That race has nothing to do with capability. That everything comes down to opportunity and environment. These are dangerous ideas in South Carolina in 1847. Samuel submits his report to his supervisor, a man named Henry Ashford. Ashford is in his 50s, career government employee, cautious, politically aware. Ashford reads the report. According to Samuel's diary, Ashford's face went pale. He read it twice, then looked up at Samuel and asked a single question. Is this accurate? Samuel confirmed that every word was true. That he'd personally witnessed and documented everything in the report. Ashford was quiet for a long moment. Then he told Samuel to speak to no one about this. To tell no one what he'd found. That the matter would be handled at higher levels. Samuel agreed, though his diary suggests he was already feeling uneasy about what handled might mean. Ashford took the report directly to the magistrate, a man named Charles Whitmore. Whitmore was well connected, from an old Charleston family, with ties to the governor's office and the state legislature. Whitmore read the report. Then he called a private meeting. Just a few men. Ashford, a representative from the governor's office, 2 members of Charleston's city council, and a lawyer named Edward Rutledge, descendant of a signer of the Declaration of Independence. Samuel wasn't invited to this meeting. He only learned about it later through Ashford, who told him bits and pieces. But the diary records what Samuel understood to be the general tenor of the conversation. These men understood immediately what Samuel had documented. They understood the historical significance, the educational achievement, the human resilience. They also understood the threat. In 1847, South Carolina was already on edge. Abolitionist sentiment was growing in the North. Political tensions over slavery were escalating. The state was defensive, protective of its economic system and social order. And here was documented proof that the entire intellectual justification for slavery was false. That enslaved people could learn Latin and French literature, could preserve sophisticated cultural knowledge across generations, could achieve everything that white society claimed they were naturally incapable of achieving. If this story became public, it would be weaponized. Abolitionists would use it as evidence. Newspapers in the North would publish it. It would fuel arguments against slavery at exactly the moment when South Carolina needed those arguments to go away. Plus, there was the legal problem. Teaching enslaved people to read and write had been illegal in South Carolina since 1740. The law had been strengthened in 1834 after the Nat Turner Rebellion. What Vandermeer had done, what the Lawrence had done, was explicitly criminal. And the current enslaved population was living evidence of that crime. 47 people who could read and write, who possessed dangerous knowledge, who had been systematically educated in violation of state law. The men in that meeting had to make a decision. Preserve this remarkable historical record, or protect the system. According to what Samuel learned, it wasn't even a long discussion. The decision was obvious to everyone in the room. This had to be buried. Completely. Permanently. Magistrate Whitmore took control. He laid out the plan. First, Samuel's report would be sealed. Not destroyed, because that might raise questions, but sealed and restricted. Filed away where no one would access it without special permission. Second, the ledger entry that Samuel had made during the estate assessment would be removed. The page would be carefully extracted, and a new page with a standard, unremarkable inventory would be inserted in its place. Third, the estate sale would proceed immediately. The enslaved population would be broken up and sold to different buyers across multiple states. South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama. Scattered so thoroughly that they could never reconstitute their community. So that the French language would die out within a generation. Fourth, anyone who knew about this, Samuel included, would be sworn to absolute silence. It would be made clear that discussing this matter publicly would have serious professional and legal consequences. And fifth, the physical evidence that Marguerite had shown Samuel, the book and papers, would be confiscated and destroyed. Whitmore made all of this sound reasonable. Necessary. He framed it as protecting the state from abolitionist propaganda. As preventing civil unrest. As maintaining social order. But what it really was, Samuel understood even then, was erasure. The deliberate destruction of evidence that challenged the comfortable lies powerful people needed to believe. Ashford returned from the meeting and informed Samuel of the decision. Samuel writes in his diary that he felt sick. That he'd documented something remarkable and watched it get buried in real time. But he was 26 years old with no power and no connections. What could he do? He was ordered to return to the Grayson plantation. To retrieve the book and papers from Marguerite. To do it quietly, without explanation. Samuel made the trip 3 days later. He writes that it was one of the hardest things he'd ever done. He found Marguerite and explained, as gently as he could, that he needed to take the materials. That it was required for the official record. He didn't tell her they would be destroyed. He couldn't bring himself to say that. Marguerite looked at him with those sharp, intelligent eyes. Samuel writes that she knew. She understood exactly what was happening. That the brief moment of hope, of being heard, was over. She gave him the book and papers without protest. But before she handed them over, she said something in French that Samuel recorded phonetically in his diary and later translated. Nous nous souviendrons. Même si vous oubliez, nous nous souviendrons. We will remember. Even if you forget, we will remember. Samuel took the materials back to Charleston. Handed them to Ashford. Never saw them again. He assumed they were burned. The ledger was altered. The estate sale was scheduled for early March. And Samuel Winters was reassigned to different duties, away from anything involving the Grayson estate. But Samuel did one thing that no one ordered him to do and no one knew about. He kept his diary. He kept his personal notes. He documented everything that happened, knowing that someday, maybe long after he was dead, someone might find it and know the truth. In his diary entry from March 2, 1847, he wrote, "Today I participated in the erasure of something extraordinary. I pray that history will someday forgive us. I know I will never forgive myself." The estate sale happened on March 8, 1847. 47 human beings were sold to 11 different buyers. Family groups were deliberately separated. The community that had preserved French language and culture for 3 generations was shattered in a single afternoon. And just like that, it was over. Or so they thought. Next week in Part 6, we'll follow what happened to those 47 people. Where they went, how they tried to hold on to their language and culture. And the one thing the authorities didn't count on. That you can scatter people across states, but you can't erase what lives in their minds and hearts. Subscribe now. Share this everywhere. Comment with your thoughts. This story was buried once. We're not letting it happen again. The Cellar that never existed. Part 6, The Scattering. Hook 000 to 045. March 8, 1847. An auction block in Charleston. 47 people who speak perfect French are about to be torn apart. Mothers separated from children, husbands from wives, families that had preserved an impossible secret for 3 generations scattered across 3 states. The authorities thought this would kill the language, kill the culture, kill the evidence, but they made one critical miscalculation. You can break up a community. You can separate families. You can erase official records. But you cannot erase memory. You cannot destroy what people carry in their minds. And in the chaos of that sale, in the desperate final moments before separation, something happened that the authorities never anticipated. The preservation would continue, just not in the way anyone expected. Part 6, The Auction. If this is your first time watching, you're missing the full story. Go back to Part 1 and watch this series from the beginning. Trust me, you need the context. And for everyone who's been here since the start, hit that subscribe button right now because Part 7 is going to reveal something that will absolutely shock you. The story doesn't end with the auction. It gets stranger. Now let's watch how they tried to destroy a community and failed. March 8, 1847. Charleston, South Carolina. The weather was cold and gray. Samuel Winters wrote in his diary that it felt appropriate. Like the sky itself was mourning. The Grayson estate sale was being held at one of Charleston's main auction houses. A large building near the waterfront where enslaved people were regularly bought and sold. Business as usual for Charleston. But this sale was anything but usual. 11 buyers had been pre-selected. This wasn't random. Magistrate Whitmore had personally coordinated it. He wanted these 47 people spread as far apart as possible. Different plantations. Different cities, different states. 3 buyers from Georgia, 4 from Alabama, 3 from South Carolina itself, but far from Charleston, and 1 from Mississippi. The goal was clear. Make sure this community could never reconstitute itself. Make sure the families couldn't maintain contact. Make sure the French language would die out within a generation because there would be no one to speak it with. The enslaved population from Grayson's plantation arrived in Charleston the night before. They were held in pens behind the auction house. Crowded, cold, terrified. They knew what was coming. They'd been told they were being sold. That the estate was being liquidated. But they didn't know about the deliberate scattering. They didn't know this was a coordinated effort to destroy their community. Marguerite was there. At 70 years old, she was probably too old to bring much money, but she was being sold anyway. Her daughter Emily, her grandchildren, the whole Baptiste family line. Jacques and Marie, the couple whose love had nearly exposed the secret back in 1823. Their children, the Leroux family, the Duchamps, all the family lines that had lived on that plantation for generations. Samuel Winters attended the auction. He writes that he was ordered to be there as part of his official duties. To witness the sale and ensure the documentation was complete. But really, he was there to make sure nothing went wrong. To make sure no one said anything about French. To make sure the secret stayed buried. The auction began at 10 in the morning. The auctioneer was a man named Morrison, experienced, efficient, emotionless. Just doing his job. The enslaved people were brought out in small groups. Families together at first, then separated as different buyers made their purchases. Samuel writes that it was brutal to watch. Children clinging to mothers. Husbands trying to stay with wives. The auctioneer ignoring all of it, just calling out ages, physical condition, skills, prices. But something strange was happening. Something Samuel noticed but didn't fully understand at the time. The people from Grayson's plantation were speaking to each other. Quietly, urgently, in French. Quick conversations whenever the auctioneer wasn't paying attention. Whispered exchanges when buyers were examining other people. They were organizing something, planning something. Marguerite seemed to be at the center of it. The matriarch, even at 70, even facing separation and sale, she was coordinating. Samuel couldn't hear most of what was being said. His French was good, but they were speaking too quickly, too quietly. But he caught fragments. Remember the songs. Teach your children. Don't let them forget. We are still ourselves. It took Samuel a moment to realize what was happening. They were making plans to preserve the language and culture even after separation. They were identifying the youngest members of each family group. Making sure those children knew the stories, the songs, the history. They were ensuring that even scattered across 3 states, the knowledge would survive. The Baptiste family was sold first. Emily and her children went to a buyer from Georgia, a plantation owner named Thomas Henderson. Marguerite went to a different buyer, a man from Alabama named Robert Crawford. Samuel writes that watching Marguerite and Emily separated was devastating. Mother and daughter, torn apart after 70 and 40-something years together. They embraced briefly before being pulled away from each other. Marguerite whispered something to Emily in French. Samuel caught it. Continue the teaching, no matter what. Promise me. Emily nodded, tears streaming down her face. I promise. Jacques and Marie were separated too. Jacques went to a South Carolina buyer. Marie and their children to someone in Georgia. The Leroux family was split between Alabama and Mississippi. The Duchamps scattered across all 3 states. By the end of the day, 47 people had been sold to 11 different buyers. The community that had existed for 3 generations was shattered. The buyers collected their purchases and began making arrangements to transport them to their new locations. Some would travel by boat, others by wagon, all of them leaving Charleston within the next few days. Samuel completed his documentation. The sale was official, legal, final. Magistrate Whitmore was satisfied. The problem had been solved. The evidence scattered. The secret would die with this generation. But Whitmore and the others made a critical miscalculation. They assumed that physical separation would be enough. That without daily contact, without a shared community, the language and culture couldn't survive. They didn't account for human determination. For the power of memory. For what people will do to preserve their identity. In the days after the sale, while the newly purchased people were still in Charleston waiting to be transported, something remarkable happened. A young woman named Celeste, part of the Leroux family, managed to get access to paper and ink. Samuel never learned how. Maybe she stole it. Maybe someone sympathetic helped her. She spent 2 nights writing. In French. Creating a document that would serve as a memory aid. A preservation tool. She wrote down songs. The full lyrics to French folk songs that had been taught by the Lawrence and preserved for 65 years. She wrote down stories, historical accounts, cultural practices, everything she could remember. She wrote down names, the full French names of everyone in the community, not the anglicized plantation names. So people would remember who they really were. And she made copies, multiple copies on whatever scraps of paper she could find. Before the families were transported to their new locations, Celeste distributed these papers. 1 to each family group. Hidden in clothing, in bundles of belongings, anywhere they could be concealed. It was an act of resistance, of preservation, a way to ensure that even separated, they would all have the same core knowledge. The same foundation to build on. Samuel learned about this months later through a chance encounter. He ran into one of the buyers, Henderson from Georgia, in Charleston on business. Henderson mentioned something strange. He'd found papers hidden in the belongings of the people he'd purchased from the Grayson estate. Papers covered in French writing. Songs, stories, names. He'd burned them, of course. Couldn't have enslaved people with written materials. That was illegal. But he was curious. Where had they come from? Samuel played dumb. Said he had no idea. But his diary entry that night reveals his true feelings. He wrote, "They are smarter and more resilient than we gave them credit for. We tried to erase them and they found a way to preserve themselves. I hope they succeed. I hope their language survives. I hope someday someone discovers what they achieved and tells the story we tried to bury." Over the following months, the 47 people were transported to their new locations. Marguerite ended up on a cotton plantation in central Alabama. Harsh conditions. Brutal overseer. Nothing like the relative stability of Grayson's plantation. She was old, not much use for field work. She was assigned to work in the plantation house. Cooking, cleaning, caring for the owners' children, and she spoke French to herself. Quietly. When no one was listening. Sang French songs while she worked. Kept the language alive in her own mind. Emily and her children arrived at Henderson's plantation in Georgia. Rice fields, similar to what they'd known in South Carolina. But a much larger operation. Hundreds of enslaved people. Emily found other mothers with young children. And in the evenings, in the quarters, she started singing French lullabies. The same ones Cécile Laurent had taught her mother 70 years earlier. Some of the other women asked what language she was singing in. Emily told them it was a language from her family. From her home. She didn't explain more than that. Too dangerous. But she taught the songs to her own children. Made sure they memorized the words even if they didn't fully understand the meaning anymore. Jacques, separated from Marie and his children, ended up on a plantation in the South Carolina upcountry. Tobacco and cotton. Hard labor. He was heartbroken, devastated by the loss of his family. But he remembered what Marguerite had said. Remember. Don't forget. He taught French words to the children in his new community. Told them stories in French, translated into English. Kept fragments of the culture alive however he could. All across 3 states. Scattered members of that community were doing the same thing. Preserving pieces. Keeping memories alive. Teaching what they could to whoever would listen. It wasn't the same as the full community. The language was degrading now without constant practice. The cultural knowledge was fragmenting. But it was surviving. In pieces. In fragments. In the memories and practices of people who refused to let it die completely. The authorities thought they'd won. Thought they'd successfully erased the evidence. They had no idea that the seeds of preservation had already been planted. Next week in Part 7, we jump forward 20 years. To the Civil War, to emancipation, and to what happened when some of these scattered people tried to find each other again. Subscribe now so you don't miss it. Share this video because this story needs to be heard. And comment below, what would you have done in their place? How do you preserve your identity when everything is trying to destroy it? The Cellar That Never Existed. Part 7 The Reunion. Hook 000 to 045. April 1865. The Civil War is over. Slavery is abolished. And across 3 states, scattered survivors of the Grayson plantation community hear the news. They are free. For the first time in their lives, they can move. They can search. They can try to find each other. Emily, now in her 60s, remembers her mother Marguerite. Wonders if she's still alive. Wonders if anyone else remembers the French. Remembers the teachers. Remembers who they used to be. Some of them begin walking. Hundreds of miles. Following rumors and whispers. Trying to reconstruct a community that was deliberately destroyed 18 years earlier. What they discover when they finally reunite will break your heart. Because you can't bring back what's been lost. But you can bear witness. You can remember. And you can make sure the story survives. Part 7 Freedom and Fragments. Welcome back to the story they tried to erase from history. If you're just joining us, you need to watch parts 1 through 6 immediately. This is not a standalone episode. And for those of you who've been with us from the beginning, thank you. Make sure you're subscribed because part 8 is going to reveal the most haunting part of this entire story. The final testimony. The last words. Now let's see what happened when freedom came. April 1865. General Lee surrenders at Appomattox. The Confederacy collapses. And across the South, enslaved people learn that they are free. The reaction is complicated. Joy, yes. Relief, absolutely. But also terror. Uncertainty. Where do you go when you've never been allowed to leave? How do you survive when you've never been paid? Who do you look for when your family was scattered decades ago? For the survivors of the Grayson plantation community, now scattered across South Carolina, Georgia, and Alabama, freedom meant something specific. It meant the possibility of reunion. Emily was 63 years old in 1865. She'd spent 18 years on Thomas Henderson's plantation in Georgia. Rice fields. Hard labor. She'd raised her children there. Buried her husband there. Survived. And she'd kept her promise to Marguerite. She'd continued teaching. Not the full curriculum the Lawrence had created. That was impossible. But she'd taught her children French words. French songs. Fragments of the stories and culture. It had degraded. Without the full community, without constant practice, the language had started to break apart. Her children spoke some French, but not fluently. Not like Emily had spoken it. Not like Marguerite had spoken it. But it survived. In pieces. When freedom came, Emily's first thought was her mother. Marguerite would be 90 years old now. If she was even still alive. Emily didn't know. Hadn't heard anything in 18 years. She decided to try to find her. Or at least find out what happened to her. The problem was that Emily didn't know exactly where Marguerite had been taken. She knew it was Alabama. A plantation owned by a man named Robert Crawford. But Alabama was a big state. And Crawford was a common enough name. Emily started asking questions. Talking to other freed people who were traveling through Georgia. Looking for anyone who might have information. In June 1865, she met a man named Samuel, different Samuel from the clerk, who'd been enslaved on a plantation near Montgomery, Alabama. He knew of a Robert Crawford. Knew the plantation. He also knew that there had been an elderly woman there who spoke strangely. Who sang songs in a language nobody recognized. She'd died 2 years earlier, in 1863. Emily felt her heart break. Her mother was gone. Had died still enslaved. Still separated from her family. But at least she knew. At least there was an answer. Samuel, the man she'd met, mentioned something else. He said that in the last months before the old woman died, she'd been teaching a young girl. The plantation owner's daughter had been sick, and the old woman had cared for her. And while caring for her, she'd sung to her in that strange language. The girl had learned some of the songs. Used to sing them after the old woman died. Emily asked if the songs were in French. Samuel didn't know, but he hummed a melody. And Emily recognized it immediately. It was a lullaby, one that Cécile Laurent had taught Marguerite 80 years earlier. One that Marguerite had taught Emily. One that Emily had sung to her own children. Her mother had kept it alive. Had passed it on, even to a white child who would never know where it came from or what it meant. Emily cried, not just from grief, but from something else. Pride, maybe, or recognition that the preservation had mattered. That Marguerite had succeeded in keeping something alive even in the worst circumstances. Meanwhile, in South Carolina, Jacques was trying to find Marie and his children. He was 54 years old. He'd been separated from his family for 18 years. He knew Marie had been sold to a plantation in Georgia. But he didn't know where exactly. Didn't know if she was alive. He started walking, from the South Carolina upcountry down toward Georgia. Asking at every plantation, every freed people's settlement, every church. Have you seen a woman named Marie? She would be about 50 now. She spoke French. Most people had no information. But in August 1865, Jacques met a woman in Augusta, Georgia, who remembered someone like that. A woman who used to sing in a strange language. She'd been on a plantation about 30 miles south. Jacques went there, found the plantation. It was abandoned now, the owner had fled. But there were freed people still living in the old slave quarters. They knew Marie. She'd died in 1861. Fever. But her children were alive. 2 daughters and a son. Adults now, living in the area. Jacques found them. It was an emotional reunion. They barely remembered him. They'd been so young when the family was separated. But they knew his name. Marie had talked about him. Had told them about their father who spoke French. Jacques spent weeks with them, teaching them what he remembered, trying to reconstruct fragments of the language and culture that had been lost. But it was hard. He'd forgotten so much. Without constant use, without the full community, the French had degraded in his mind too. He could still speak some. Still remembered songs and stories. But it wasn't the same as it had been. Wasn't the complete, sophisticated fluency he'd grown up with. All across the South, similar reunions were happening. Or not happening. Some people found each other. Some learned that their loved ones had died. Some never found any information at all. By late 1865, a small group of survivors had made their way back to South Carolina. Not to the old Grayson plantation, which had been destroyed during the war, but to Charleston. Charleston had become a gathering point for freed people. A place where people came looking for lost family members. Where information was shared and connections were made. In November 1865, 6 survivors of the original Grayson plantation community met in Charleston. Not planned, just chance encounters that led to recognition and reunion. Emily was there, 2 of Jacques' children, a woman named Josephine from the Leroux family, a man named Antoine from the Duchamps, and a young woman named Claire who'd been a child during the 1847 sale. They gathered in a small church, and they spoke French together for the first time in 18 years. It was emotional, painful, joyful, complicated. They realized immediately how much had been lost. Their French was broken now, mixed with English, degraded. They remembered different things, different songs, different stories. The knowledge had fragmented, but they still had pieces. And together, they had more than any of them had alone. They decided to document what they remembered, to write it down before more was lost. The problem was finding someone who could write in French. Most of them could still read a little, could still write some, but not well enough to create a proper record. They needed help. In December 1865, they approached a teacher, a northern woman named Margaret Wells who had come to Charleston as part of the Freedmen's Bureau educational efforts. She was teaching freed people to read and write. Margaret spoke French. She'd been educated in Boston, had studied French literature. The group told her they wanted to preserve something, a language and culture they'd maintained for generations. They asked if she would help them write it down. Margaret agreed. Over several weeks, she met with the group. They spoke to her in French, told her their history as much as they knew it. They didn't know the full story. They knew about teachers who had come long ago, knew about the plantation and the secret language. But they didn't know about the shipwreck or Vandermeer's experiment or the deliberate scattering. They just knew that their ancestors had learned French and had passed it down. That it had been precious, sacred, something worth preserving. Margaret wrote everything down. The songs they remembered, the stories, the French words and phrases, the cultural practices. It wasn't complete. It was fragments, pieces of something that had once been whole. But it was something. A record, a testimony. Margaret also wrote down their personal stories. Where they'd been sold in 1847. What had happened to them during the 18 years of separation. Who had survived and who had died. It was heartbreaking. Of the original 47 people sold in 1847, maybe 15 were still alive by 1865. The others had died during those 18 years. Disease, overwork, violence, old age. The knowledge had survived in fragments across multiple people. But the community was gone. Could never be fully reconstructed. In January 1866, Margaret completed the documentation. She made 2 copies. One she gave to the group. One she kept for herself. The copy she kept would eventually end up in the archives of a Boston university. Filed away. Forgotten for over a century. The copy the group kept would be passed down through families. Preserved. Protected. And it would become evidence. Proof that this community had existed. That they'd achieved something remarkable. That they'd fought to preserve it even when everything was trying to destroy it. The 6 survivors in Charleston stayed in touch for the rest of their lives. They met occasionally, spoke French together when they could, kept the memory alive, but they knew the language would die with them. Their children spoke English, knew some French words, some songs, but not the full language. By the end of the 19th century, the French would be gone completely. Just a memory, a story passed down in families. A story about ancestors who had spoken a secret language, who had preserved something precious against impossible odds. Next week in Part 8, we return to Samuel Winters, the clerk who documented it all in 1847. We'll discover what he did with his diary, why he kept the secret for decades, and what finally made him break his silence at the end of his life. Subscribe now, share this story, comment with your thoughts. This history matters. These lives mattered. We can't let them be forgotten again. The Cellar That Never Existed. Part 8 The Confession of Samuel Winters. Hook 000 to 045. December 1889. An elderly man sits in his study in Charleston, dying of cancer. Samuel Winters is 70 years old. For 42 years he's kept a secret that has haunted him every single day. He participated in the erasure of something extraordinary. Watched as 47 people were scattered to destroy evidence of their achievement. And he said nothing, did nothing, followed orders like a good bureaucrat. But now, at the end of his life, Samuel makes a decision. He's going to tell the truth. He's going to make sure someone knows what really happened. He writes a letter, seals it with his diary, and gives instructions that it should only be opened after his death. What that letter reveals will connect every piece of this mystery, and expose the cover-up for exactly what it was. A deliberate, coordinated destruction of evidence that threatened the entire foundation of slavery. Part 8 The Deathbed Letter. If you haven't been following this series from Part 1, go back now. You need the full story to understand what we're about to uncover. And if you've been here since the beginning, smash that subscribe button because Part 9 is going to reveal something that will absolutely stun you. The physical evidence that survived. Now let's see what Samuel Winters finally admitted. Samuel Winters lived a quiet life after 1847. He continued working as a clerk in Charleston. Never rose to any position of real power or importance. Never married. Never had children. He lived alone in a modest house. Went to work, came home, kept to himself, but he never forgot what happened at the Grayson plantation. Never stopped thinking about Marguerite and the community he'd helped destroy. His diary, which he kept faithfully for over 4 decades, is filled with references to it. Guilt, regret, shame. In an entry from 1852, 5 years after the scattering, he writes, "I saw a French book today in a shop window. It made me think of Marguerite and the hidden materials I took from her. I wonder if she's still alive. I wonder if she hates me. I would not blame her if she does. I hate myself." In 1861, when the Civil War started, Samuel wrote, "Perhaps this war is God's judgment on us. On me. For what we did to those people. For what we buried." In 1865, when the war ended and slavery was abolished, he wrote, "They are free now. The ones who survived. I hope they found each other. I hope some fragment of what they preserved still exists. I hope my participation in its destruction can somehow be forgiven, though I know I do not deserve forgiveness." Samuel never spoke publicly about what he knew. Never told anyone the full story. He'd been sworn to silence and he kept that oath. But in December 1889, everything changed. Samuel was diagnosed with stomach cancer. The doctor gave him 3 months to live. Maybe less. Samuel was 70 years old. No family. No close friends. Just himself and his secrets. And he made a decision. At the end of his life, he would tell the truth. He couldn't undo what he'd done. Couldn't bring back the people who'd died. Couldn't restore the community that had been scattered. But he could create a record. He could make sure that someday, someone would know what really happened. In late December 1889, Samuel wrote a letter. A long, detailed confession. He started by explaining who he was. A clerk who'd been assigned to catalog the Grayson estate in 1847. A young man who'd stumbled into something historically significant and watched it get buried. Then he told the whole story. Everything he'd witnessed. Everything Marguerite had told him. The Lawrence and the shipwreck. Vandermeer's experiment. The 3 generations of perfect French preservation. The community's achievement. He described the meeting where powerful men decided to erase it all. Named names. Magistrate Charles Whitmore. The governor's representative. Edward Rutledge the lawyer. All of them. He explained the plan to scatter the families. The confiscation and destruction of the physical evidence. The alteration of official records. He wrote about taking the book and papers from Marguerite. About the look in her eyes when she understood what was happening. About her last words to him. We will remember. Even if you forget, we will remember. Samuel's letter is brutally honest about his own complicity. He doesn't make excuses. Doesn't try to justify what he did. He writes, I was young and powerless, yes. But I was not without choice. I could have refused. Could have spoken out. Could have found a way to preserve the evidence instead of helping to destroy it. I did not. I chose my career and my safety over truth. I chose comfort over courage. I have lived with that choice for 42 years and it has poisoned every day of my life. The letter goes on for 20 pages. Handwritten, detailed, precise. At the end, Samuel includes specific information. Names of the people who were sold. The buyers who purchased them. Locations where they were sent. He includes descriptions of the hidden book and papers. Quotes from the materials he'd seen. Details that only someone who had actually witnessed everything could know. He's creating evidence. Building a case. Making sure that anyone who reads this letter will understand that it's true. That this actually happened. Samuel sealed the letter with his diary. All 42 years of entries. Everything he'd witnessed and felt and thought about the Grayson plantation mystery. He gave the package to his lawyer, a man named Jonathan Pierce, with specific instructions. The package was to be held sealed until 25 years after Samuel's death. Then it was to be donated to the Charleston Historical Society with a note explaining that it contained important historical documentation. Why 25 years? Samuel explained in a note to Pierce. He wanted everyone directly involved to be dead first. Whitmore. The other men who'd orchestrated the cover-up. Even himself. He didn't want the revelation to hurt anyone personally. Didn't want it to be about revenge or blame. He just wanted the truth to eventually be known. Samuel Winters died on February 14, 1890. His funeral was small. A few acquaintances from work. The lawyer Pierce. No one who really knew him. Pierce honored his instructions. Kept the sealed package in his office safe. And when Pierce himself died in 1903, his son inherited the law practice and the responsibility of safeguarding Samuel's confession. In 1915, exactly 25 years after Samuel's death, the younger Pierce donated the package to the Charleston Historical Society as instructed. It was labeled as the personal papers of Samuel Winters, clerk, died 1890. Historical documentation regarding Charleston area estates. Not particularly exciting. Not obviously important. The package was filed in the archives. Catalogued. And forgotten. It sat there for decades. Through World War I. Through the Depression. Through World War II. Through the Civil Rights Movement. Researchers occasionally came across references to it in the catalog. But, personal papers of a minor clerk, didn't seem worth the time to examine. There were more obviously important collections to study. It wasn't until 1967 that anyone actually opened it. A graduate student named Patricia Morrison was doing research on antebellum Charleston economic records. She was looking through estate sale documentation, trying to understand property valuations and market fluctuations. She requested several collections, including Samuel Winters' papers, thinking they might contain useful economic data. When she opened the package and started reading, she realized immediately that she'd found something extraordinary. This wasn't economic data. This was a confession, a cover-up, a lost piece of history. Patricia spent months verifying Samuel's claims, cross-referencing names and dates, tracking down what records still existed. Some of it checked out. The Grayson plantation had existed. Thomas Grayson had died in 1847. The estate had been liquidated. 47 people had been sold. But most of the official records had been altered or destroyed, exactly as Samuel had described. The ledger page he mentioned was missing, replaced with a generic inventory. The report Samuel had written was nowhere to be found in official archives. Sealed and hidden, just as he'd said. Patricia found the altered documentation. Found the gaps where information should have been. Found evidence of the erasure. She also found something else. In a completely different archive, at a university in Boston, she found Margaret Wells's documentation from 1865. The testimony of the 6 survivors who'd reunited in Charleston. Their fragmentary memories of French songs and stories. Their accounts of the scattering and what had happened to them. It corroborated everything Samuel had written. Different sources, different perspectives, same basic story. Patricia was stunned. She'd uncovered evidence of a historical cover-up. Of an educational achievement that had been deliberately erased. Of a community that had preserved sophisticated knowledge against impossible odds. She wrote her dissertation on it. Published papers. Tried to bring attention to the story. But it was 1967. The civil rights movement was ongoing. The country was in turmoil. And a story about enslaved people in South Carolina speaking French in the 1840s seemed too strange, too specific, too unbelievable to gain much traction. Some historians were interested. Some found the evidence compelling. Others were skeptical, questioned whether Samuel's confession could be trusted. Whether the whole thing might be an elaborate hoax. Without more physical evidence, without the actual book and papers that had been destroyed, it was hard to prove definitively. Patricia continued researching for years. Published a book in 1974. It sold modestly, got some academic attention, then faded from public awareness. The story, once again, was in danger of being forgotten. But Patricia had done something important. She'd created a record, published the evidence, made sure that Samuel's confession and the survivors' testimonies were available to anyone who wanted to look. And she'd raised a question that historians are still debating today. What else has been erased? What other remarkable achievements, what other evidence of human resilience and capability, has been deliberately destroyed because it was inconvenient? Because it challenged comfortable lies. Samuel Winters spent 42 years feeling guilty. Spent his whole life haunted by what he'd participated in. But in the end, by preserving his testimony, by making sure the truth eventually came out, he did something redemptive. He made sure they weren't completely forgotten. Made sure that Marguerite and Emily and Jacques and all the others would be remembered. Not perfectly, not completely, but remembered. Next week in Part 9, we're going to explore the biggest mystery that remains. The one question Samuel couldn't answer. Marguerite told him that their French came from lessons in the cellar. But there was no cellar on the property. So what did she mean? The answer is going to change everything you think you understand about this story. Subscribe now, share this everywhere, and comment with your thoughts. Do you believe Samuel deserved forgiveness? I'll see you next week. The Cellar That Never Existed, Part 9. The Underground Truth. Hook 000 to 045. The lessons came from the cellar. That's what the eldest woman told the magistrate's clerk in 1847. But when they searched the Grayson plantation, there was no cellar. Just red clay and bedrock. No basement, no underground room, nothing. So what did she mean? For over 150 years, that single detail has haunted researchers. Because everything else in the story checked out. The French was real, the community was real, the cover-up was real. But the cellar, it never existed. Or did it? In 2003, something was discovered that changes everything. A detail so disturbing, so perfectly hidden, that it reveals the darkest truth about Vandermeer's experiment. The cellar was real. It just wasn't what anyone thought it was. And what happened there explains why the authorities were so desperate to erase this story forever. Part 9: The Hidden Room. Welcome back. If this is your first time here, stop everything and go watch parts 1 through 8 right now. This entire story builds to what we're about to reveal. And for everyone who's been on this journey with us, make sure you're subscribed because part 10, the finale, drops next week. We're going to tie every thread together. Now let's solve the mystery of the cellar that never existed. The cellar. It's been the one unexplained detail from the very beginning. When the magistrate's office interviewed the enslaved population in February 1847, before Samuel Winters arrived, a preliminary clerk spoke briefly with the eldest woman. She was listed only as Maggie, aged approximately 70. According to the preliminary notes, which survived in fragmentary form, the clerk asked where they had learned French. Her answer, recorded phonetically because the clerk didn't speak French, Les leçons du sous-sol. The lessons from the cellar. The lessons from the basement. The clerk noted this and moved on. But when officials searched the property looking for evidence of where this education might have occurred, they found nothing. The main plantation house had no cellar. No basement, just a raised foundation to protect against flooding, standard for low country architecture. The slave quarters had no underground spaces. They were simple wooden cabins on ground level. The building Vandermeer had used as a schoolhouse, later listed as storage, had been torn down years earlier. But property records and foundation remnants showed it had also been ground level. No cellar. So the authorities concluded that the old woman was confused, misremembering, using cellar as a metaphor for something else. Maybe a dark room, maybe just the schoolhouse itself. They didn't investigate further. They had bigger concerns, like erasing all evidence of the French-speaking community. And for 156 years, that's where the mystery sat. Researchers who studied Samuel Winters' confession and the survivors' testimonies noticed the cellar reference. Wondered about it, but without access to the actual property, which had been destroyed and rebuilt multiple times over the centuries, there was no way to investigate. Until 2003. In 2003, a development company bought 600 acres along the Cooper River, about 15 miles north of Charleston. They were planning to build a luxury housing development. Golf course, waterfront homes, the whole thing. Before construction, they were required to do an archaeological survey. Standard procedure to make sure they weren't destroying anything historically significant. A team from the University of South Carolina came out to do the survey. Led by an archaeologist named Robert Chen. The land had been plantation property in the antebellum period. Several different owners over the years. The original structures were long gone, but there might be remnants of foundations, burial sites, artifact deposits. The team started their survey in May 2003, using ground-penetrating radar and traditional excavation methods. Within 2 weeks, they found something strange. In the northern section of the property, in an area that had been heavily wooded and relatively undisturbed for over a century, the ground-penetrating radar detected an anomaly. A void space underground, rectangular, approximately 20 feet by 15 feet, about 8 feet below the surface. Dr. Chen's team was intrigued. Underground voids in that area were unusual. The water table was high. Clay soil, not conducive to natural cave formation. They began excavating, carefully removing layers of soil and sediment. At about 6 feet down, they hit brick. Old brick, handmade, consistent with late 18th or early 19th century construction. They'd found a buried structure. An underground room. The team expanded the excavation. Over several weeks, they uncovered the full extent of the structure. It was a brick-lined underground room, accessed originally by a stairway that had collapsed and been filled in. The room itself had a vaulted brick ceiling that had partially collapsed but was still partially intact. Inside the room, they found remnants of wooden furniture. rotted and fragmentary, but identifiable as benches or tables. They found slate fragments that might have been writing surfaces. They found pieces of oil lamps. And they found something else. Something that made drive. Chen immediately contacted historians specializing in antebellum South Carolina. They found books, or what remained of books. The paper had mostly degraded, but some pages survived in the drier parts of the room. Protected by the collapsed ceiling. The pages were in French. Dr. Chen's team carefully extracted and preserved what they could. Brought in paper conservators. Documented everything meticulously. When they pieced together what they'd found, the conclusion was inescapable. This was the schoolhouse. The place where Philippe and Cécile Laurent had taught from 1782 to 1785. But it wasn't just a schoolhouse. It was an underground schoolhouse. A hidden classroom. A cellar. Vandermeer had built it underground deliberately. To hide what was happening. To make sure no passing visitor, no neighboring planter, no random traveler would see enslaved people being educated. It was brilliant in a horrifying way. The building above ground, the one listed in property records as a schoolhouse and later as storage, was probably just a shell. A normal-looking structure that disguised what was actually happening below. The entrance would have been inside the building. Stairs leading down. The classes held underground where no one could see or hear. When Vandermeer destroyed the evidence after Cécile's death, he didn't just tear down the building. He collapsed the underground room and buried it. Filled it in. Planted trees. Made it disappear. And it worked. For over 200 years, no one knew it was there. Dr. Chen's team spent months excavating and analyzing the site. What they found painted a vivid picture. The room had been well constructed. Ventilation shafts to bring in air. Oil lamps for light. Benches arranged in rows like a classroom. The book fragments they recovered were educational texts. A French grammar primer. Part of a history book. Religious texts. Exactly what you'd expect in an 18th century schoolroom. They also found something more personal. Hidden in a crack in the brick wall, they found a small leather pouch. Inside were papers, more intact than the books because they'd been protected. When conservators carefully unfolded the papers, they found handwritten notes. In French, in two different handwriting styles. One was lesson plans, teaching notes, grammar exercises, written in a neat, educated hand. The other was student work. Sentences copied out, vocabulary practice, written in a less polished hand. Someone learning. The teaching notes were dated 15/1783. August 15, 1783. They were signed, C. Laurent, Cécile Laurent, the teacher from the shipwreck. Her actual handwriting, her actual lesson plans. This was physical proof, not just testimony, not just second-hand accounts. Actual evidence that Philippe and Cécile Laurent had existed. That they had taught here. That the whole story was real. Dr. Chen immediately recognized the historical significance. He contacted historians, archivists, specialists in antebellum slavery and education. One of the people he contacted was Dr. Patricia Morrison, now in her 60s, retired from active teaching but still following research on the Grayson plantation story. When Patricia heard about the discovery, she flew to South Carolina immediately. She spent days at the excavation site, examining the evidence, reading the fragments, and she cried, because after 36 years of trying to prove this story was real, of facing skepticism and doubt, here was proof. The cellar existed, the lessons had happened, everything Samuel Winters had confessed, everything the survivors had testified to. All of it was true. Patricia worked with Dr. Chen to document everything. They published their findings in 2004. Academic journals, historical publications, news articles. The story finally got the attention it deserved. Not just as a curiosity, but as evidence of something profound. Evidence that enslaved people, given education and opportunity, achieved exactly what anyone else could achieve. That the claims of inherent inferiority were lies. That the entire justification for slavery was built on deliberate falsehoods. And evidence that when this truth was documented in 1847, powerful people chose to destroy it. Chose to erase it. Because it was too dangerous to allow. The underground schoolhouse explained something else too. Why the authorities were so determined to scatter the families and bury the story. It wasn't just that the enslaved population spoke French. It was that they'd been educated in a deliberately hidden, elaborately constructed underground classroom. That Vandermeer had gone to extraordinary lengths to make this happen. Had built a secret school. Had imported teachers. Had run a multi-year educational experiment. This wasn't enslaved people accidentally picking up a language. This was systematic, intentional, sophisticated education. Proof of premeditation. Proof that slaveholders knew, absolutely knew, that enslaved people were capable of learning anything. And that knowledge was explosive. The 2003 discovery changed everything. The Grayson plantation story went from being a disputed historical footnote to accepted fact. Museums created exhibits. Documentaries were made. The story entered textbooks. But something was still missing. The human voices. The direct testimony from the people who lived it. Samuel Winters had provided facts. The survivors had provided fragments. But no one had the complete story in the words of someone who was actually there. Until 2008. Next week, in the final episode, we reveal the last piece of evidence. A journal that survived hidden for 160 years. Written by someone from inside the community. In French. Describing everything. The teachers. The lessons. The scattering. The preservation. In their own words. Subscribe right now so you don't miss the finale. Share this video everywhere because this story needs to be told. And comment below. What do you think happened to that journal? Who wrote it? I'll see you next week for the conclusion. The Cellar That Never Existed. Part 10. The Last Testament. Hook 000 to 045. A estate sale in Savannah, Georgia. A woman is sorting through boxes of old family papers when she finds a small leather-bound book. The pages are yellowed, fragile, covered in handwriting. French handwriting. She can't read French, so she almost throws it away. But something makes her hesitate. The care with which it was bound. The deliberate way it was hidden inside a Bible. She takes it to a university. And when scholars translate what's inside, they discover the holy grail of this entire mystery. A first-hand account written by Émilie Baptiste in 1866. The daughter of Marguerite. A woman who was there for everything. Who learned from Cécile Laurent herself. Who survived the scattering and lived to tell the truth. This is her testimony. In her own words. And it reveals the one thing we've been searching for all along. What it actually meant to live this impossible story. Part 10. Émilie's Testament. This is it. The finale. The conclusion to a story that spans over 220 years. If you haven't watched parts 1 through 9, you've missed the entire journey. Go back and watch from the beginning. And if you've been here for this whole investigation, thank you. Make sure you're subscribed because we have more buried history to uncover. Stories they don't want you to know. Now let's finish this. The journal was found in 2008 at an estate sale in Savannah, Georgia. The woman who found it was named Rebecca Coleman. She was helping clean out her great-aunt's house after the aunt died at age 92. Her aunt had been a pack rat. Kept everything. Boxes and boxes of old papers, photographs, family documents going back generations. Rebecca was sorting through it all, trying to decide what to keep and what to throw away, when she found a wooden box tucked in the back of a closet. Inside the box was an old Bible. Published in 1820. Worn, used, clearly important to someone. And tucked inside the Bible, sewn into a piece of cloth attached to the back cover, was a small leather-bound journal. Rebecca carefully removed it. The leather was cracked and dry but intact. The pages were yellowed but readable. She opened it and saw handwriting. Beautiful, careful handwriting, in a language she didn't recognize. French, she guessed, but she couldn't read it. She almost put it back. Almost filed it away with the other family papers. But something about it felt important. The way it had been hidden. The care that had been taken to preserve it. So she took it to a professor at the University of Georgia. Someone in the history department who might be able to tell her what it was. The professor, Dr. Elizabeth Hartman, took one look at it and knew immediately that it was significant. The handwriting was from the mid-19th century. The French was sophisticated, educated. And the first page had a title. Mon témoignage, l'histoire de notre peuple et notre langue. My testimony, the history of our people and our language. Below that, a name. Émilie Baptiste. And a date. Janvier 1866. January 1866. Dr. Hartman asked Rebecca if she could study the journal. Rebecca agreed. Over the next several weeks, Hartman carefully translated the entire journal. It was about 80 pages long. Filled with Émilie's handwriting, her story, and what she read was astonishing. This was the missing piece. The first-hand account from inside the community. Written by someone who had actually lived through everything. Dr. Hartman immediately recognized the connection to the Grayson plantation story. She contacted Patricia Morrison, who was now 70 years old but still following any new developments. Patricia flew to Georgia, read the translation, and for the second time in this story, she cried. Because here it was. The complete picture. In Émilie's own words. Let me read you some of what Émilie wrote. This is translated from the original French, but I want you to hear her voice. Her testimony. Émilie begins. I write this so that our story will not be lost. So that my children and their children will know where we came from and what we preserved. I write this in French because French is who we are. It is the gift we were given and the treasure we protected. She describes her mother Marguerite. How Marguerite was 16 years old when the teachers arrived from the sea. How she became one of their best students. Émilie writes, my mother told me that Madame Cécile was kind but sad. That she taught as though each lesson was precious. That she made her students feel valuable, intelligent, worthy of education. My mother said this was the greatest gift. Not just the French language, but the knowledge that we were capable of learning it. Émilie describes the underground classroom. The cellar that no one believed existed until 2003. We went down the stairs into the room of learning. It was cool and quiet. Safe from watching eyes. Master Vandermeer did not want others to know what we were becoming. We studied there 6 days each week. Reading, writing, mathematics, history. We learned about France as though we might someday walk its streets. We learned poetry as though words were treasures we could keep in our hearts. Where no one could take them. She writes about Cécile's death. And here, Émilie reveals something that the official records never admitted. Madame Cécile did not fall from the cliff. My mother saw what happened. Master Vandermeer's overseer pushed her. She was going to leave, going to tell the authorities what we had learned. And so they killed her. My mother watched from the trees. She told me this only once, when I was older. She made me promise never to speak of it aloud. But I write it here so the truth is known. Murder. Not an accident. Deliberate silencing. Émilie describes the years after Cécile's death. How the community continued teaching each other. How Marguerite became the primary keeper of the knowledge. My mother taught me everything Madame Cécile had taught her. Every song, every story, every grammar rule. She was determined that nothing would be lost. She said the French language was our inheritance. Our resistance. Our proof that we were more than what they claimed we were. Then Émilie writes about 1847. The year everything fell apart. Master Thomas died and strangers came. They heard us speaking French and their faces showed fear. Not curiosity. Fear. Because we were proof of something they did not want to be true. Within weeks, we were sold. Scattered. Torn apart. She describes the auction. The separation from her mother. I held my mother's hand until they forced us apart. She whispered to me in French. Continue teaching. Promise me. I promised. It was the last time I ever saw her. I carried that promise for 18 years in slavery. And now, in freedom, I carry it still. Émilie writes about her years in Georgia. How she taught her children French even though it was dangerous. How she kept the language alive in fragments. The French degraded without the community. Without daily practice with others who spoke it fluently. My children learned some words, some songs. But not the complete language my mother knew. Not the sophisticated French that Madame Cécile taught. I failed in that. I could not preserve it perfectly. You can feel her grief in those words. The sense of loss. Of something precious slipping away despite her best efforts. But then Emily describes 1865. Freedom. And the reunion in Charleston. When I found others who remembered, who still spoke fragments of our French, I wept. We spoke together and remembered together. We were broken pieces of something that had been whole. But we were still something. We still carried the memory. She writes about meeting Margaret Wells, the northern teacher who helped them document what remained. Miss Wells wrote down our songs, our stories. She treated our knowledge with respect. She understood that what we had preserved mattered. That we had achieved something remarkable. She gave us that recognition. That validation. It meant more than she could know. Near the end of the journal, Emily writes something that breaks my heart every time I read it. I am writing this in 1866. I am 64 years old. The French language that was once spoken by 47 people is now spoken fluently by no one. My children know pieces. My grandchildren will know less. Within 2 generations, it will be gone completely. Erased. As though it never existed. But I write this testimony so that someone, someday, will know. Will understand that we were here. That we learned. That we preserved. That we resisted in the only way we could. By becoming educated. By maintaining our humanity and our dignity. By refusing to be what they claimed we were. They tried to erase us from history. Scattered us. Destroyed the evidence. But memory persists. Truth persists. And now, in freedom, I can finally speak that truth. Emily's final entry is dated March 1866. I do not know who will read this. Perhaps my children. Perhaps strangers in a future I cannot imagine. But whoever you are, know this. We existed. We mattered. Our achievement was real. Do not let them tell you we were incapable. We proved otherwise. Remember us. The journal ends there. Emily Baptiste died in 1871 in Georgia. She was 69 years old. The journal was passed down through her family. Protected. Preserved. Hidden in that Bible for 142 years until Rebecca Coleman found it in 2008. The discovery of Emily's journal was the final piece of evidence. Combined with Samuel Winters' confession, the survivors' testimonies, Margaret Wells's documentation, and the 2003 archaeological discovery of the underground classroom, it created an irrefutable historical record. This story was real, all of it. The shipwreck, the teachers, the experiment, the 3 generations of perfect French preservation, the deliberate scattering, the cover-up, all of it actually happened. And it proves something profound. Something that terrified authorities in 1847 and should humble us today. Human potential has nothing to do with race. Everything to do with opportunity. Given education, given resources, given respect, people achieve extraordinary things. The enslaved people of the Grayson plantation proved that. Proved it so convincingly that the evidence had to be destroyed. But they couldn't destroy everything. The memory persisted. The testimony survived. The truth endured. Today, there's a historical marker on the site where the underground classroom was found. It tells the story of Philippe and Cécile Laurent. Of Cornelius Vandermeer's experiment. Of the 3 generations who preserved French in isolation. There's a museum exhibit in Charleston featuring Emily's journal, Cécile's lesson plans, and artifacts from the excavation. The story is finally being told. Finally being recognized as the remarkable historical event it was. And Marguerite's words from 1847 came true. We will remember. Even if you forget, we will remember. They remembered. And now, so do we. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of the most extraordinary buried stories in American history. If this story moved you, share it everywhere. Subscribe to this channel for more hidden history. And tell me in the comments, what story should we investigate next? What other truths are waiting to be uncovered? Remember, History isn't just what's written in textbooks. It's what people fought to preserve. What they risked everything to remember. And what we have a responsibility to honor. This is the story of the cellar that never existed. Except it did. And the people who learned there, who taught there, who preserved what they learned against impossible odds, deserve to be remembered forever. Their names were Marguerite, Émilie, Jacques, Marie, and 43 others. They spoke perfect French. They achieved the impossible. And they proved that truth, eventually, always finds a way to survive. Thank you for watching. And never forget,